Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Since February 2011, a movement has swept across northern Africa from Tunisia to Egypt and across other parts of the Arab world and the Middle East. After decades of oppression by corrupt governments that refused to be accountable to the people, ordinary people rose up and demanded democracy. After decades of rich elites robbing ordinary people of a decent economic future, people rose up and demanded a fair economy. Movements like these arose also in Spain and in other countries. During the fall of 2011, a similar movement arose in the United States. Like the international movements, the Occupy Wall Street movement rose up against a corrupt government that refuses to be accountable to the people, and rose up to protest against an economic system that is rigged in favor of the extremely rich and is destroying ordinary people's economic futures. Local Occupy movements have occurred in about 2,000 cities across the United States. Mainstream news media have misunderstood and misrepresented them, and politicians have tried to co-opt them. But ordinary people understand, and public opinion polls show that about 2/3 of Americans support the Occupy movement. This month's TV program will explore this phenomenon, its roots, its issues, its principles, its activities, and its future. So I'm happy to welcome 4 guests who have a lot of firsthand experience and good insights with the Occupy movement. I'm happy to welcome Mary Abramson, Bill Moyer, Dana Walker, and Kyle Tanner. Good to have you all here.
Nice to be here.
When I introduced the program, I mentioned that the Arab world's democracy movement and the Spanish Indignado movement. Could anybody say anything else about the international roots of this?
Well, I think this is a global movement, and it started really in the Middle East, and we saw these young people standing in front of tanks. And they're quoting the Declaration of Independence, our document. And it's taken a while, but the Arab Spring has finally moved over, and we have our American autumn.
I think it was fascinating that we had Egyptian protesters buying pizza for folks in Madison when they were occupying the Madison Capitol. So I think that was immediately a connection and affirmation of the links between the growing populist movement here and existing the international populist movement.
And when we had the Madison sending us pizza
pizzas
when we were
occupied
occupying
our
the
capital.
Capitol here in Washington.
Yeah. So the solidarity of this is just amazing.
It's great. Yeah, it's great.
It's really fun. Bill, you mentioned Lawrence Goodwin's book, The Populist Movement, the populist moment.
Yeah.
And so you see some roots of this that go back more than 100 years.
Yeah, well, the populist moment of that Lawrence Goodwin's book speaks about the 1890s when organizers worked with communities to help them organize cooperative marketing, storage and marketing of their crops to help them get out of a debt cycle. And simultaneously, they evolved an analysis and transmitted and educated folks on a political platform. So I don't think we're at that maturity yet for the Occupy movement, but I do see the potential, and I think that part of the lesson of the populist movement in the 1890s is that it was a movement that made a difference in people's lives. And I think for the last 10, 12, multiple years, we've been so enraptured by what we can do online with our, with clicktivism or mouse click activism, that we've become a little bit stagnant, and we've lost track of maybe what social movement actually is, and it does make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, people have the sense that sending an email is organizing, and it's way more than that. I keep thinking you got to get face to face. You got to get with people.
Well, these populist movements, they had big groups. It was nothing to get 20,000.
Yeah.
And back then, they didn't have the populations we do.
Right.
And 20,000 was massive, and same with the labor movement. people got out and they massed together. So that's coming back, I think, with the Occupy movement.
Yeah. When we were preparing for the program, I talked with each of you on the phone to find out what points you wanted to make, and each of you told me something about Wall Street's greed and some of Wall Street's crimes and how that crashed the economy, where they just recklessly gambled in some extremely risky ways and lost. And instead of holding Wall Street accountable, they got the government to bail them out. Would any of you flesh out some of this? Give us some information.
I wouldn't really call it gambling. I was saying it was a rigged game from the beginning, and they caused it all to happen because they knew they would cash in no matter what happened.
Okay.
And it was basically the biggest criminal fraud in all human history, and now everybody but the criminals are being made to pay for it, while the criminals themselves continue to record record profits.
Yeah. Their profits are high. They're sitting on humongous amounts of money, the big Wall Street banks and so forth. And so when people say, oh, gee, the economy is hurting, no, it's going great for them. It's just for 99% of us that it's not doing well.
And everybody treats the economy like it's just some mysterious force with a mind of its own, and everything that happens is totally controlled. And they make it happen, every single thing that happens.
Other ways to connect the dots? Or
I think it's, I think it's a lack of effective regulation is primarily the problem here. The market is supposed to play a role of protecting the interests of the citizens, of being a buffer between the intentionality of the marketplace to commodify everything for profit with all of the fallout that creates, and our interest to live in communities and promote the public good. And when the government is clearly shown in this case, and over time, as the power of corporations have grown and as they have become more savvy about how to flex their political muscle, the government has simply shown a lack of will to effectively regulate the marketplace in the public interest.
Well, we used to have the Glass-Steagall Act that for decades, going back to the 30s, kept real banks away from investment banks. Those functions were separate institutions. And in the 90s, that Congress threw that out, and they could do as they darn well pleased.
Right.
And that was an essential firewall, right, between securities, investment banking, and
real banking.
Real banking, as we in real banking. That was an essential firewall that came out of a primary piece of learning from the experience of the Great Depression. And that was the Glass-Steagall Act was if you look historically, was the focal point, right? That was literally our learning moment and our moment of resolution that based on a very deep conversation around risk assessment in the economy. And that has not happened at all since the housing crisis of 2008. Not at all.
Right. The things that the entities that were too big to fail are even bigger because they've swallowed up the smaller ones that went under.
And they're
like
doing all the same things again now.
The same stuff.
It's the same that Dana had said, though, that it really goes beyond the big banks and a little higher up the pyramid. And let's talk about the Federal Reserve that came in 1913. And then you had the crash later. Well, it was all manipulated. And Thomas Jefferson prophesied this when he said, I fear the banking system more than I do standing armies, that if the American public ever allowed the bankers to control of their money, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that grow up around the banks will deprive everyone of their property till their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. So this is exactly what's happened. What they do is they inflate the money, they take all their interest out of it, they deflate it and buy everything up when it's down. This is exactly what J.P. Morgan did in the Great Depression. He bought up 100 small banks doing this. They're doing the same thing, just like Dana says. It's all planned. This is what people are starting to wake up to that there is a very small group of elites that are controlling our banking system. And it's not just our Federal Reserve, it's the central banks in Europe, and it's even the International Monetary Fund. And it's a scam. We have right here in our city a producer of a Academy Award-winning documentary, Inside Job, that everyone in the Olympia area should watch. Tells a lot about this. Secret of Oz on another award-winning documentary. We can't possibly educate everybody tonight, but the information's there in the internet about this.
I think kind of bringing some of these ideas together, the collusion between corporate power and elected power has become so systemic, and the corruption so now obvious, that the false game of election cycle politics that entrance us is in competition now with a real game, a social movement, emerging social movement consciousness, and maybe the reemergence of a consciousness about what is social movement. It's people transcending those artificial distractions. I'm not saying they're unimportant. I'm just saying that when the corruption and the collusion is so deep, those become inadequate vehicles to actually make change, and thus it really necessitates it makes it almost inevitable that a social movement will rise.
Yeah. Well, the big corporations, the oil companies and the big banks and all that, give to both political parties. And they tend to give, historically, they've been giving more to whoever is in power and whoever is likeliest to win the next election. And so, like, Obama got Goldman Sachs money last time more than
they were his biggest private contributor.
More than any politician has gotten from anybody ever. And his cabinet is full of Goldman Sachs people who are basically making all the economic decisions for his administration. And they've lined up again to give him lots of money for the next cycle. But it doesn't matter which party, because it's the same interest, and they fund both. They just it's investing in politicians, and they get a big return on their investment.
Well, there's a functional reality to this. I mean, as a person who's works actively as a political consultant, and sometimes in the electoral field, it is very expensive to run for office. And when you're talking about federal office, I mean, Bill Bradley's book, if you've ever had a chance to read about it, when he's talking about how he spent his first 6 years in the Senate raising the money to win his reelection, right? Imagine if you're on a 2-year cycle in a federal congressional district that is 150 square miles, right? The volume of television that you have to buy. And so we by allowing corporate money right into the electoral cycle, we're actually driving the cost of politics, because it means if one candidate receives additional money, they're going to buy more TV, which means the other candidate has to buy more TV, right? And it's a cycle that is self-perpetuating, and as you see cycle after cycle, that number just continue to get larger.
Right, and it's worse after the Supreme Court made their decision in the Citizens United case, which basically said it's okay for corporations to spend as much as they want out of their regular budget, out of their regular pot of money to buy elections.
And there are several hundred corporations that could raid their petty cash drawer and make or break any politician in the country, including the president.
Right.
But then Karl Rove said it would only take $50 million and he could buy most of the states, the Congress people in most of the states.
I think in a sense that the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in January 21st, 2010 was in fact actually a favor for us of actually laying out the reality that we're within, and it wasn't the beginning of the problem. Clearly, it was age-old problem, but at least it's a 130-year development, and the restrictions on corporate spending or on wealthy to influence elections was whittled away at, and now it's basically been thrown out, and so it basically it allows us to see the corruption, allows everybody to see the corruption. It defines the lines more clearly, because we're not in a conflict here that can be defined by what they call attrition warfare, where you just take this many troops and goes against this many troops. So we're not in an equal. We don't have equal forces in this fight. We're in an asymmetrical conflict. We can never compete with Wall Street for enough money. We can't do political pacts to get money out of politics. It's an oxymoron. It should cause a cognitive dissonance. It's important that we realize that we're in a conflict that is really fundamentally a moral conflict, and that's why social movement is so essential, because we don't have a monopoly on violence. We're underfunded, and so our only resource, our treasure, are the principles we hold and our relationships with our communities and the relationships with each other.
And the fact that 99% of us are on one side.
Much clearer.
And people know that. So we can't outspend them in a campaign, but we can outvote and outorganize them if we do it right.
And we don't have to be distracted by some of their campaigns that artificially divide us.
Well, we had a case come along just lately, the Tea Party, that supposedly has some populist roots, although it turns out it was funded by billionaires, the Koch brothers, and other powerful, rich interests. But I wonder if you could tell us something about how you see, Bill, how you see the Tea Party's populist impulse in relation to the Occupy movement's populism.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I would trace it back to the progressive Democrats and this sort of Beltway revolving door.
Beltway meaning the
Washington
D.C.
based nonprofit industrial complex that is this revolving door between agencies and office and think tanks, etc. And I believe that this populist moment started during the Paulson plan at the end of the Bush administration.
Henry Paulson was the
Secretary of the Treasury.
And ex-CEO of Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, how bipartisan of them.
Making your point. And that, and Congress decided it was going to give $700 billion, the entire price tag of the Iraq War up to that point, to this to bail out the banks in 1 week. And at that moment, we had more people on the left and on the right unified, understanding the nature of the conflict and where the battle lines really are. But those groups, they failed to take leadership. I was on a call because I was involved in organizing against that, and they said, "Oh well, they're going to do a workaround. Go get out the vote." At which point I just said, "You guys, we should be ashamed to call ourselves movement leaders if this is our Argentina moment when we could be banging pots and pans in the street, and all we can tell our people is to get out the vote." So that left a vacuum, I believe, into which, because nature abhors a vacuum, into which the Tea Party had an opportunity to present a faux populism that really just appealed to the worst in people, their xenophobia, their fear, etc., without actually offering any critique or analysis.
Right. Because they come across as being opposed to abusive concentration of power, but they really mean we don't want the power of the government to protect the environment or provide health care or education or something. But the real abuses of power, there's the potential for them to see what you folks are seeing, which is the economic abuses of power. Go ahead.
I kind of disagree because I actually went to some of the early Tea Party movements before it got hoodwinked and pulled. And I think the people that are in it are still of the mindset that they're seeing their money, their taxes being used for things they don't want. They're seeing a huge federal government And a lot of these people are savvy about the way the government was set up in the original way, with a balance between states and federal. And what's happened is, here's the federal with all the money up here. That's what I think what the original Tea Party was talking about, was the federal government's taking all of our money and spending it wildly, and they are. Income, I mean, and the media and everything has turned this. If you go to the meetings, it's not what you're hearing on the media. So you have to realize that the same corporations control the major media, and they're going to spin everything to their benefit.
Right.
So I would be a little more gentle with the Tea Party people, because they are really part of the 99, and they're really understanding that something's very, very wrong in government. And most of them are not saying not to get out of war and keep the military industrial. That is the spin of the media against the Tea Party.
Actually, I went to 2 different Tea Party rallies, and they were totally different from each other. One of them was basically working people who were scared more than anything else, and you could have a conversation with them and talk with them. The second one was a bunch of screaming ranters who were just screaming, calling people foul names. So, I mean, there's Tea Parties and there's Tea Parties too. So,
So, Kyle, I wonder if you can give us some information about the specific origins of Occupy Wall Street, because we want to look for this, which seems to be a very genuine populism that seems to be addressing the realities. Tell us about the origins.
Well, you know, I think with any popular movement, it's hard to displace it from everything that's come before, right? All of us who are involved in the search for social and economic justice stand on the shoulders, really, of giants and of all of the generations before us who have thirsted for basic dignity and the recognition of human rights. I think in this case, Adbusters put out the call, right? A social criticism journal,
and that's
right?
a very creative magazine coming out of Vancouver, BC.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so Adbusters put out the call, right? Kind of tongue in cheek, in reality, I think, to Occupy Wall Street, and so some nascent, right, organizing and conversation began to happen around this. And, you know, Bill and I were lucky to be at the Backbone Action Camp, which is a very fine program that his program, Backbone Campaign, puts on every summer. And I was honored to teach this past summer. Some of the folks who provided the backbone, right, to Zuccotti Park and in D.C. and in Boston, right, were there. And they were answering the call, right? U.S. Uncut, and they were...
U.S. Uncut was our country's equivalent of UK Uncut, which has to do with people in Britain were upset because they're suffering from an austerity program of cutbacks in health and education and stuff, and yet big corporations in Britain are not paying their fair share of taxes.
Yes.
And ordinary people are stuck with that tax burden, and their tuition is rising and all that stuff. So they created a movement there, and then people here picked up on it. So I just want to make sure the viewers know the...
And they should, and they
are.
absolutely should.
Great stuff.
And Chris Priest in particular, right, who was one of the folks that we were able to share space with that week. Fantastic, you know, primary organizer for U.S. Uncut Boston, had run direct actions in the bank. These wonderful, creative, musical, diverse direct actions in the banks, right? They weren't locking down, you know, they weren't throwing stones, they were lampooning. They were enjoying themselves, right? And calling attention in a very creative and constructive way to corporate greed and malfeasance, and how they had managed to use political privilege to crack open the public treasury to their own end, and how people were suffering as a result from that. And so these groups, as these very potent, creative minds, threw their lot in, right? And they decided to show up in Zuccotti Park, right? And we're going to show up on Wall Street, right? And then, well, maybe we should decamp here in Zuccotti Park, right? They're not going to let us continue down the street. Maybe we should decamp here. And thus it was born, and for several weeks, there was virtually a media blackout around it. And the Internet Collective Anonymous were the ones who really promoted this, and I think progressive networks that many of us, that are more savvy about this and plugged in for some period of time, we were talking about it and found it exciting. But Anonymous blew it up on social media, for lack of a better expression, right? They were the ones who got it trending on Twitter, who put it out on Facebook, who were making videos, and in fact, that's something of an untold story, is the role of that group in the early growth of Occupy around the country and the world.
And you know when an idea's time has come when it appears everywhere. And so there have been like about 2,000 of these in all kinds of, not just big cities, but small towns. Occupy Forks.
Cody, Wyoming.
Yeah. Every place.
Remember, it was not that long ago, about 2 years ago, that the coffee party emerged. It was kind of a phenomenon, and it grew really fast. And then U.S. Uncut grew really fast. So there was obviously energy there.
Yeah.
One thing that I think that ties some of these ideas together, from what you were talking about, Mary, is the idea that a lot of us want to hold our government accountable to the ideals that we were told it is about. Right. Meaning, like things that are rooted in the Declaration of Independence, which is a rights-based document, where our obligation to each other stems from our mere existence, not our statehood, etc. We have a Constitution that is not a rights-based document, even though we've been fooled into thinking possibly it is. And so I think that it's a property rights-based document. It's a property-based document. And so there's a conflict within our culture between these things. And I think the international movement for a rights-based movement, the emergence of the populism here, and even some connections to the struggles around the Tea Party, some aspirations there that, although this is a problem, they want to be they want to worship the Constitution. But I think that one of the differences is that I think we're trying to appeal to a human rights-based thing, the inalienable rights that we saw in the Declaration, and get back. And I think that the Citizens United stuff, that all evolves out of a perversion of constitutional rights that are now given to corporations, where they're claiming speech, et cetera. Now pretty soon they're going to want Second Amendment rights to bear arms.
The thing about this Declaration of Independence is that it's about the sovereignty. The absolute sovereignty is the individual. And although at that time there wasn't full equality, that was the vision for the future. That was the vision in Thomas Jefferson when he said all men and women. He didn't say men and women, he said men, but it's plural for men and women. That was the vision. So we eventually had women's suffrage, and we eventually had the amendment to free the slaves. So we should be moving into understanding that equality. And the governments were the creation of the collective sovereign, our creation, to keep us safe and happy, to develop that. But the idea was that wasn't to be a big thing. It was just in time of war and things like that. What's happened is our creation now is the sovereign. Government is the sovereign. And it's flipped. And what this movement is kind of understanding that but we have to turn it back. We are the sovereigns.
I'll tell you what resonates with me here is, I grew up in the country. I'm country folks, Eagle Scout, right? Class president. And I grieve. I developed a set of values and mores when I was young, growing up amongst honest, hardworking people that, and I was taught a history, right, about the higher ideals of our founding documents, and and later I would learn about the Scottish Enlightenment, right, and the informing principles, philosophical principles. But I think, to me, many of us who have decided to engage with the Occupy movement are in a way grieving, And by living in these spaces and by working cooperatively together and in opposition to a social and economic model that only values us as elements of competition, right, and constantly pitting us together, that it is an incredibly radical moment. And that's what makes it different from U.S. Uncut, right, from a moment of activity, from a moment of protest to a movement, right, is that we are operating cooperatively, and we're not shoving people to the edge simply because they don't agree with everything we say. We're struggling with the hard questions as a community.
And it's inclusive, so everybody
Totally
is welcome
inclusive,
to come and
totally.
talk things through.
Absolutely.
I mean, we pretty much are in agreement among ourselves, but we have some things that where we see things differently. But I know that the conversations, from what I've heard, conversation has been important, and that's how you build something. Well, I want to just follow up on a thing on the Declaration of Independence. When the folks in New York created what they called a declaration, and this was in end of September, I think, or something. And it's a list of grievances. And I read that, I thought, this is what the Declaration of Independence was. If you go back and read the Declaration, it's a list of grievances.
This is the second
Most of it
revolution,
is.
folks.
Yes,
Let's wake up
that's
and
right.
join in.
I mean, it's the
That's
list
it.
of
We're doing
grievances.
it.
It says
We're
all
doing
this stuff is coming down on us. They're doing that to us, and we're not going to take it anymore. And so we have inherent human rights. We're the sovereign, and we're just going to declare our independence from England. They can't do this to us anymore.
Right.
And they had that same flavor and even a similar format of the list of grievances in that declaration that came out of New York.
We are saying no to the tyrants.
Yeah.
It was the England before, but now we're saying no to the banking families.
Yeah.
You know, the
And
new
I think
tyrants.
some of us want the political sophistication of the Port Huron Statement, right? So I looked at that set of grievances
And that was the
and I said,
founding
okay,
document for Students for Democratic Society
That's exactly
in about
right.
1961.
yeah. And remained a living document, right? Hayden was 22, I think, when he first started drafting it. And so for a person like me, right, with a little water under the bridge and as a, professional organizer in this, I looked at that set of grievances and I said, okay, this is fine for people living in a park, right, with a month under duress, right, doing this, but I want a Port Huron statement, right? I want a social platform. I want to go deeper with these questions, and that's going to require me going and staying in the park myself, right, and investing my time.
I want to pick up some of the themes from the Occupy movement. It's different from others in that it's got a determination to stay grassrootsy with a horizontal culture instead of a hierarchical. It's not like, oh, let's vote for some guy to run this thing for us. Right.
Exactly.
It's holding on to that grassrootsiness where people can have these kinds of conversations like you're talking about.
Yeah, even the tyranny of the majority, too, it rejects that.
Yeah. So everybody's included. They operate by consensus. Could some of you talk about some of those direct democracy aspects?
It's been an amazing experience to be in a group, and I have to say we were so different. You tend to stay in your, we're in a book club together. We kind of read the same book. Now I'm with people that have lived on the street for 3 or 10 years. I'm with young kids from Evergreen that are just fantastic. And they've got this novel idea that we're going to reach 100% consensus. And we're in a park that's too small and has a lot of problems, and we're offered a bigger park where we can grow. And it took us 2 days, hours and hours in group, because this young Evergreen group had to have 100% consensus. And I would say, well, how about if we do 90%? Or then later, how about, if only 1 or 2 object, can we do it? No, we're going to do 100% consensus. I thought, oh, these kids, this will never work. By golly, it worked. And what happened was, you have to do amendments and things, but if someone says, that's against my core belief, you respect it. And suddenly, in that couple days, we developed something that was the vision of our founding fathers, a republic, where one is for all and all is for the one. If the one really didn't want it, okay, Johnny, we're not going to do it because you just don't, we'll do something else. It's fantastic. It really works. It takes a long time, but we broke down a lot of barriers between the stratuses of different people there. It's a wonderful process, and I'd say if we could get that park back, they took it down to, they're trying to take it down at this moment. It's a great experience for all cultures and all groups and different, to live together and reach consensus about how they're going to live 100%. Sorry.
Other, great, thanks.
Too
Yeah.
much.
Other thoughts on this? Can somebody talk about the General Assembly, the concept of the General Assembly and how it works?
Well, essentially, anyone who elects shows up at the appointed hour, and
It's a regularly scheduled
event. And I should point out that we have decided in Olympia that every Sunday at 1 p.m. we will hold the space in the Capitol Rotunda. So from now until we no longer meet, every Sunday at 1 p.m. in the Capitol Rotunda, we'll be holding a General Assembly, and we certainly invite everyone to attend. Please come and be a part of it. Each one is a voting partner, right? We have, and so essentially how a General Assembly works is everyone comes together. We use a set of hand signals, right? So, various, let's speed it up.
Believe me, it's easy to learn them.
It's easy to learn. So we spend a little time educating people about the cultural and structural emphases of the General Assembly. We agree on a facilitator, and then that person begins leading us through the working group report outs. And the working groups are groups of self-selected individuals that by subject or interest are doing autonomous work and bringing that back to the group.
So we would think of those as like committees.
Like committees.
Food committee, safety committee.
Sure. First aid, housing, structures, that sort of thing. And then we move into proposals. And not the way we have decided to do it that works well in Olympia is some of our General Assemblies are informational and conversational, and some are designed to be decision-making General Assemblies. And we have also agreed on a structure where you don't necessarily vote on the proposal at the General Assembly you bring it to. And we encourage people to bring, as Mary's quite good at doing, bringing your proposals in writing. And that gives that levels the playing field so that it can be put up on the website, it can be spread on the list, and people can have a physical copy at that time so that they can take it home, ruminate on it, discuss with their peers, and then come back and vote at the next meeting.
Okay. Dana, you on the phone when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned that the group has committed to nonviolence as a way of operating. That what we've been discussing is very inclusive and human and so forth, which is part of the spirit of nonviolence. And you told me on the phone that there have been conversations with folks about getting to the point of actually committed for nonviolence.
Yeah, I'm not a pacifist ideologically, but strictly because that is the most effective method to fight an asymmetric battle against somebody who has an omnipotent military and omnipotent police.
Yeah.
So it's more effective. Plus, when you're speaking violence, basically you're taking the battle to their turf, and you're speaking their native tongue. They know how to react, and plus you lose your public support. Plus, when they come and beat you on the head when you get violent towards them, then everybody cheers them on. Whereas if you're just sitting there peacefully and they're beating on you, they become the bad guys, and you get the public support.
And that's been very clear in the videos that have gone viral, several of them with police.
Right, and another reason the Occupy movement really took off was the video of that New York policeman macing those three girls.
Right.
That was, up until then, the media had been totally ignoring it.
Yeah.
I mean, some of us, who follow alternative media knew about it, but then all of a sudden it became front page, every newspaper.
Tony Baloney.
Because of that video.
Right.
Yeah.
And if anybody would have attacked that cop, that would have been the story.
Right. And we would have lost all the support.
And the movement would have died down in there.
Yeah. And so it takes a strict adherence to nonviolence. I know that's part of your methodology and things that you.
Well, I think I was part of the occupation of Freedom Plaza in Washington D.C. and it was it was actually being planned at Seize D.C. It was October2011.org prior to the call for occupying
Right.
Wall Street. But then things, built upon each other, and so, and my whole purpose when I went there was to help create the identity, because like what you're saying is so true. We know that the people, because our violence is not a tool for us, it's not going to help us, that we have to appeal to the people. And the people want to see a sympathetic action. They want to see themselves in what they're viewing on TV, and sympathize. We want grandma baking cookies for the occupation. We don't want her calling the police on the occupiers. So there's a strategic concept called motherhood and mismatch, which is that fundamentally, if we want to create trust with the population, our cause has to be as close to the moral equivalency of motherhood as we can possibly get it. Right. And we don't get it by beating on doors and biting policemen. We get it by holding candles, speaking the truth, and allowing the violence that's inherent in the system to expose itself.
Right, and it has been, so people can see. It's same like with the civil rights movement in the South. A bunch of African Americans who want to vote, and the cops come and beat the crap out of them for wanting to vote. I mean, you can see where what's going on.
Yeah.
I want to mention or check with you about another aspect of this, the human aspect of this. The participation has been very diverse, and including a cross section of people who have various kinds of problems: mental illnesses, substance abuse, very young people, homeless folks, on and on and on, and the Occupy locations have become sort of default social service providers, because people come there and they feel welcome. If you're homeless, everybody wants you to go away. They dump on you in some way, and here people feel welcome.
A big part of the movement is compassion. In fact, the logo that we're developing is Occupy Everywhere in a big heart. Integrity, liberty, and compassion, those are kind of the three buzzwords of the Occupy movement. Yeah, and everybody's equal, and everybody's loved, and they're welcome into the movement. They're part of, I don't even like 99. It's really 100%. We're talking about structures that we're trying to bring down, not people. So yes, someone that doesn't have family, and we have a lot of people in camp that do not have family. Just for example, a kid that went to foster care. At 18, he's out. Who's taking care of this kid? He's totally on his own from 18. Somebody that's gone through the system in foster care. These are the kind of people that have gravitated to the movement because it's become a home and
a community.
A community. They're learning that people care about them. I had an older woman who's been on the street, I don't know how long, say to me, this is the first time in my life I've ever felt loved. So as they take down our tents tonight, it was all worth it for that one woman.
Right, and the taping night is December 15. The program will air in January. Who knows what the setting will be by January when people watch this, but.
And I found it ironic is basically the Occupy camp is taking in all the people the machine has thrown on the trash heap and forgotten about, and now they're criticizing us by saying, "Oh, this has just become a homeless camp, and look at all these druggies, and look, they're all hanging out there. We need to close the camp down because all these homeless and drug addicts are there."
Right, and it's not like you caused that. The economic system.
It all happened in the last 6 weeks.
There's no homelessness until then. The economic and political systems that have been devastating this country have been causing epidemics of homelessness and mental illness and everything else, and the Occupy folks have taken these folks in and given them a home, and it's embarrassing to the system because it exposes again the system's faults and flaws and defects, and and it's like the system doesn't want to have a successful alternative model out here showing that it is possible to welcome people in and include them in a grassroots democracy.
I'll tell you,
It's just like the federal government's been trying to destroy Cuba, and they're trying to destroy Venezuela. And when in the 80s, Reagan was trying to destroy the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. You can't allow a successful alternative to exist because it's a successful alternative to the dominant status quo.
if you really go into the depth of the economic system that we have worldwide in place and how it striates all the wealth to the top, and this is like slavery because of debt. We have debt slaves. The difference being that the masters don't care. They want them destroyed. They want them out of sight. At least the masters in Thomas Jefferson's time, they took care of them. They could not release them because there wasn't anything in place for them to survive. So I'm looking at the 21st century. What happened? We've gone way down. It's because of this structure, the banking structure, that is making us all into debt slaves.
And I think in another way, if I may, another way that I think about it from a place of really, really a place of humility, is that the Occupy movement hasn't made a home for these people. We haven't made a place for these people. They've made a place for us. We are now living in the parks, right? They're teaching us how to stay warm,
that's
right? How to stay safe, and it is, and we should not sugarcoat it. It is a heck of a struggle. None of us is trained to deal with the issues of profound mental illness and sometimes, substance abuse, right, that have led to these conditions. And it has been transformational for me, and one of the things that has opened my heart in a new way and cracked open, my thick skin, having done this work for a while, is to come into relationship with people and be vulnerable myself in a moment of support for a person who is profoundly vulnerable in the world.
And I think the whole community here, or much of the community, has been very supportive.
Oh, yes.
I can't imagine
Absolutely.
how many times I've talked to some friend of mine who says, oh, I fixed up a big kettle of casserole or soup, or I'm taking wet sleeping bags home and putting them through the clothes dryer.
Absolutely. We'd like to all thank the whole Olympia community. You are just so amazing.
So many people have been doing so much stuff.
Fantastic, yes,
yes. And again, it's that connectedness of, everything that we've been talking about here has to do with human connections and mutuality. So somebody who has a clothes dryer can help out somebody who has a wet sleeping bag, and so forth.
I don't think I don't necessarily disagree, but with what's been said. I think it's very, deeply moving. At the same time, I struggle because I don't see that every occupation is the same. And the tolerance for different kinds of behavior is different in different places. And I think that as we're building capacity, trying to build a sense of the analysis or strategic framework or build skills, I question whether it's that we should be engaged fully in this, trying to create a utopian society in the park, or trying to supplement the failed delivering services that the state's failing to deliver, and become so internally focused that we fail to actually organize and build capacity for externally directed action. And I have a little bit of a internal struggle because I don't want to be uncompassionate. At the same time, I don't want to see us get bogged down.
You end up being enabling to a dysfunctional system, just like somebody who's enabling a chronic alcoholic by calling in and say, "Oh, he can't come to work today. He's not feeling well," when really he's horribly hungover. It's enabling. So it's possible to do enabling for a system that has turned its back on humanity.
Well, I know.
So I see where you're at. I mean, it's
Right. We've all struggled
Yeah.
like Bill with that.
Yeah, Bill, and that's, you know, in fact, Bill and I are of the same mind. I mean, I think that was a personal reflection, really, of mine. I mean, I have been one of the agitators in camp for Occupy 2.0, right? When do we start liberate Wall Street? When do we start liberate Olympia, right? And because in a functional way, it's not sustainable because we are entirely reliant on the broader Occupy community to cook our food, to wash our bedding, you know, to donate the food that we cook. And we have been profoundly blessed to be in a community of plenty where people have been willing to share, but that can't last forever. And I am primarily political, right? I went there to be political. My heart was opened by the personal experiences I've had in that space, but I am still interested in calling the question on corporate power and its effect on our lives.
And that's where we go next with this conversation, and we're getting pretty tight on time, so I want to cover the next few topics pretty briefly so we can get everything covered. Bill, you've talked about, and others, about, you know, the reforms are not sufficient. You know, we need more profound change, and that's where the conversation is headed right now. When the public recognizes there's some problem that has to get addressed, somebody in Congress will draft some bill, and then it gets watered down, and then they pass it, and it's full of loopholes and doesn't solve the problem. And the Occupy movement seems not willing to settle for an incremental thing. They have a
We're tired of
bigger
Band-Aids.
We're
tired of Band-Aids.
So, and this is something that you wanted to talk about the political calculus that's involved. Can you mention something of that kind of briefly, and then we'll get on to the next?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to want something big, but we have to work from the power we have to the power we need to actually implement that. So growing the movement is a prerequisite for actually implementing. The thing that I think is important to remember is that reform may be the outcome, but compromising principles is not the way to win the people.
Right.
Speaking always from a place of principle and holding the ideal forward is how we get into the negotiation, and we build power to at least for goodness sakes, for a change, let's actually go to the table and negotiate, be good negotiators. Yeah. So, and obviously, because of the collusion problem we've spoke about earlier, the fundamental issues of corporate personhood, et cetera, there's constitutional amendment, but maybe we should be calling for a constitutional convention, you know, and maybe we'll end up getting a constitutional amendment. So I think that it's just mostly important that we don't do the punching on the political calculus that confuses people with the idiosyncrasies of public option, that we actually talk about the health that is a human right, and we hold that ideal. Right. And then if we speak from our ideals and our principles, people will trust us. If we speak like politicians and lawyers, they will not trust us.
Right. There are a couple. One of the things that seems to be bubbling up as a concern, and has been for a few years, has been the crisis with foreclosures, where so many people are losing homes. And I've heard various people locally and beyond talk about multiple ways of dealing with it. On the one hand, it's like if people know the legalities of how to challenge it, you know, where in some cases the banks didn't even have clear title, or somebody signed off on something without having done the right stuff. There's that kind of a thing, and people can be empowered and trained to do that and enforce their rights. And the other thing is you occupy a home, help a family in solidarity with living there, and I mean, so there's a direct action.
Yeah, that's happening.
And so that's one thing that seems to be happening as where do we go from here if you're not in a park? And people around the country are doing those kinds of things. I think that's exciting and worth looking at. I want to put in a plug for the organization that you work with, the Backbone Campaign, www.backbonecampaign.org. There's some other groups going on. There's occupyourhomes.com that's doing what we just talked about. There's newbottomline.com that's looking at those kinds of things and alternatives to the big banks and all that. There are a number of things. Certainly occupyolympia.org and Occupy Wall Street, although street's not all spelled out as occupywallst.org. But great resources, and from any of those, people can move on and find some more. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Are there other fresh approaches? You talked about before expanding alliances, growing our capacity. Several people have talked about building skills and networking. Other things briefly from folks?
Well, the thing that I wanted to bring up is that this occurred probably primarily because of the bailouts. And at that time, I remember Barbara Boxer, senator in LA, said, you know, we're getting like 100 to 1 that we're not to do this, but we're going to do it. That was so maddening. It showed us, and she said everybody's getting 100 to 1. So in other words, our representatives in Congress are not doing what the representatives are asking. 100 to 1, they're not doing it. That angered the Americans. I think that's the anger. We're suddenly awake that, oh my God, they really aren't doing what we ask. She even said it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's
What
also
do you
a
do?
fix. I think that there's a fix right now that people are
Yeah. What do you do when Obama didn't do anything he said he was going to do? He
Right.
turned out to be just like.
Yeah.
So what do you do?
Sachs.
Who are we
Yeah,
supposed to
yeah.
vote
Right.
for?
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah.
that's the dilemma that we're in, and we're still trying to problem solve how
we
we're
should
going to
make
get out of that
we should
one.
make a delineation, right? For me, for this moment, for this Occupy moment to become a movement, we have to shift from a protest culture to an organizing culture.
Right.
We have to recognize that as successful movements before, this is going to take a generation. This is going to take 2 generations. It's not a simple thing, and we have to gird ourselves and develop our communities and networks to last through the storm.
We'll bring Bill back to our TV program in the spring of 2012, and we'll spend some time talking about organizing, movement building. We're rapidly running out of time.
May I add one really important thing, that the Occupy is not just about space. The occupation is a metaphor for occupying our authority, our imagination, and our power.
Right, very good,
Getting our
thank you.
sovereignty back.
So I want to thank Mary Abramson and Bill Moyer and Dana Walker and Kyle Tenner. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. Real democracy goes way beyond voting. It requires working on the issues and getting involved and doing things. I want to thank the folks, not just here, but beyond, who've been helping with the Occupy movement elsewhere, and encourage people to connect. You can get information about a wide variety of additional issues related to peace, social justice, nonviolence by contacting Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093 or www.olympiafor.org. We're all one human family. We share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs you. You can help.
The Declaration of Independence, our document. And it's taken a while, but the Arab Spring has finally moved over and we have our American Autumn.
I think it was fascinating that we had Egyptian protesters buying pizza for folks in Madison when they were occupying the Madison Capitol. So I think that was immediately a connection and affirmation of the links between the growing populist movement here and existing the international populist movement.
And but we had the Madison sending us pizza
pizzas
when we were
occupied
occupying
our
the
capital.
Capitol here in Washington.
Yeah. So the
So
solidarity of this is just
yeah,
amazing.
it's great. Yeah, it's great.
It's really fun. Bill, you mentioned Lawrence Goodwin's book, The Populist Movement, The Populist Moment.
Yeah.
And so you see some roots of this that go back more than 100 years.
Yeah, well, the populist moment of that Lawrence Goodwin's book speaks about the 1890s when organizers worked with communities to help them.
This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Since February 2011, a movement has swept across northern Africa from Tunisia to Egypt and across other parts of the Arab world and the Middle East. After decades of oppression by corrupt governments that refused to be accountable to the people, ordinary people rose up and demanded democracy. After decades of rich elites robbing ordinary people of a decent economic future, people rose up and demanded a fair economy. Movements like these arose also in Spain and in other countries. During the fall of 2011, a similar movement arose in the United States. Like the international movements, the Occupy Wall Street movement rose up against a corrupt government that refuses to be accountable to the people, and rose up to protest against an economic system that is rigged in favor of the extremely rich and is destroying ordinary people's economic futures. Local Occupy movement
Them organize cooperative marketing, storage and marketing of their crops to help them get out of a debt cycle. And simultaneously, they evolved and analysis and transmitted and educated folks on a political platform. So I don't think we're at that maturity yet for the Occupy movement, but I do see the potential, and I think that part of the lesson of the populist movement in the 1890s is that it was a movement that made a difference in people's lives. And I think for the last 10, 12, multiple years, we've been so enraptured by what we can do online with our, with clicktivism or mouse click activism, that we've become a little bit stagnant, and we've lost track of maybe what social movement actually is, and it does make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, people have the sense that sending an email is organizing, and it's way more than that. I keep thinking you got to get face to face. You got to get with people.
Well, these populist movements, they had big groups. It was nothing to get 20,000.
Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. Have occurred in about 2,000 cities across the United States. Mainstream news media have misunderstood and misrepresented them, and politicians have tried to co-opt them. But ordinary people understand, and public opinion polls show that about 2/3 of Americans support the Occupy movement. This month's TV program will explore this phenomenon, its roots, its issues, its principles, its activities, and its future. So I'm happy to welcome 4 guests who have a lot of firsthand experience and good insights with the Occupy movement. I'm happy to welcome Mary Abramson, Bill Moyer, Dana Walker, and Kyle Tanner. Good to have you all here.
Nice to be here.
When I introduced the program, I mentioned that the Arab world's democracy movement and the Spanish Indignado movement. Could anybody say anything else about the international roots of this?
Well, I think this is a global movement, and it started really in the Middle East, and we saw these young people standing in front of tanks. And they're quoting